Hi, this is Module 2, Lecture 3 for the course Introduction to International Relations. And this lecture is going to really do a deep dive into realism, which is the first of the three major schools of thought that we cover in this class. So to begin, remember from the previous lecture that in the article in the Minks and Snyder textbook, they combined idealism and constructivism, but that is a little bit confusing and not entirely accurate. So what we're going to show you right now is idealism as opposed to realism, and what you learned as idealism slash constructivism is actually more about constructivism, which we'll cover later. So suffice it to say for the moment, idealism is kind of an intellectual forebear of liberalism, and we're going to show how idealism and realism are different from one another. Idealism is often associated with this guy, who is former President Woodrow Wilson. Also, fun fact, he was the last president of the United States to have a PhD. So idealism is associated with the following tenets. Idealists think that human nature in general is good, and that international relations is shaped by the moral compass of the actors involved. Woodrow Wilson in particular was very driven to think of international relations in these terms, and that for him, we had to get everyone in the international community onto the same kind of moral fabric in order for there to be greater peace and cooperation. Idealists also recognize that decision makers possess psychological motives, so it's not as if when we're analyzing the behavior of states that we can only rely on these theories broadly construed as representing what an entire country is interested in. We have to also acknowledge the fact that there are leaders at the helms of these countries, and they have their own different idiosyncrasies, particularities, and backgrounds. So it's just a way of nodding in the direction of acknowledging that decision makers are real people and that they have their own kinds of individual biases and preferences and desires that may influence their decision making, especially when they're in very difficult spots, like during times of conflict or when they have to make a rushed decision. Another important distinction that idealists want to promote is that they view the international system as a community. So as opposed to realists, which we'll see in a moment, kind of think of it in more conflictual terms, the international system for idealists is really a system in which these morals kind of drape or cover all of the countries. Of course, there's going to be some holdouts and some deviants, but it's a community of states that have similar goals, and oftentimes those goals are more related to the preservation of order than they are for the emergence of conflict. But that's very different from what realists believe. This is a famous person associated with realism, Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. For realists, human nature is inherently bad. You basically cannot trust other people, just as if you can't trust other states. So that kind of puts you in an automatically defensive position or offensive, depending on what kind of realist you are. And it suggests that you can't really ever know what other states' intentions are, but you know that if your intentions are to increase power, then it's likely that the other actors are thinking similarly. So for realists, international relations is shaped by this quest for power. States rationally pursue their own self-interests, which means that they do things that work in the service of achieving their goals, whatever those goals might be, but they are oftentimes tied to power and survival. And so unlike the more low-key approach to the international system in terms of thinking about it as a benevolent force, realists think of the international system as marked by anarchy. And so this is really important, but for realists, anarchy doesn't mean chaos. This is what we tend to think of in the domestic context, right? When there's no leader and everyone is engaging in looting and plundering and that kind of thing. That's not what realists mean when they talk about anarchy. Anarchy in the context of international relations simply means the absence of a higher authority. So there is no super government that controls what states do. So that means that states have to come up with some way of deciding how they're going to conduct themselves, because they can't rely on a world government to tell them that their decisions are right or wrong. It's more of a horizontal system as opposed to a purely hierarchical one. So the absence of higher authority means that the international system is anarchic, and that causes all kinds of problems. So in a realist mindset, this anarchy drives insecurity. It drives the quest for power, especially because, as we mentioned with the first bullet point here, that you can never be sure about the other's intentions, but it's likely that humans are by their very nature, inherently bad. So they're not something that you can trust, and that affects the way that states behave. We have to view state behavior in a skeptical kind of mindset. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the features of realism in particular. Relating it back to the first lecture when we talked about the different principles of international relations, remember there were 3 of them. Well, realism is founded on the principle of dominance. So the way that we can solve collective action problems is to establish a hierarchy which reduces the amount of uncertainty in the international system. So it's very clear who the major actors are, it's very clear what their roles are, and the most powerful actors get to do what they want, and from Thucydides, like we covered in the last lecture, the weak kind of have to suffer what they will. For realists, political power is more important than morality, than ideology, or other kinds of social or economic considerations. So that quest for power is really the currency of international relations. It's the driving force that motivates state behavior. And just to kind of articulate this in a way that some of you may be familiar with, others of you may not be, in the book The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli has this quote, which is, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Oftentimes people kind of misconstrue this and say that he simply argued that it's better to be feared than loved, but he really says, as you can tell from the quote here, if it's not possible to be both of these things, you should err on the side of wanting to be feared by your adversaries as opposed to being loved. And so if you have time and want to check it out, I recommend going back to the page for Module 2 and watching the very short clip from one of my favorite movies, A Bronx Tale, in which one of the main characters, who's a mobster, Sonny, is talking to his progeny, his mentee, Cologeno, about this very concept and how it kind of plays out in the real world of mob life in New York City. So that's a really kind of interesting way of taking this abstract concept and this idea that we can't trust other humans, and seeing what that looks like in a practical setting, albeit in a sort of fictional one. So check that video out if you get a chance. Another just a kind of fun way of recapping this idea. This is taken from one of my favorite TV shows, The Office, and here you have the manager, Michael Scott, saying, "Would I rather be feared or loved? Easy, both," right? Kind of in accordance with what Machiavelli said. But he says his spin on it is, "I want people to be afraid of how much they love me." Okay, now central to international relations from a realist standpoint is this concept of power. So let's talk a little bit about power. One kind of very basic definition of power is it refers to the ability of an actor to do what it would not have otherwise done, or to get an actor to do what it would not otherwise have done. So it's some kind of strong compellence to get an actor to do something that either it was not already deemed in their own best interest, or something that they actually don't want to do but are kind of being coerced to do by another more powerful actor. It is measured in terms of different things, and this kind of depends on who you ask, but the 2 major areas of measuring power are material on the one hand and non-material on the other. So material characteristics include things like the size of a country, how rich they are, the size of their armed forces. These are things that we can point to and identify as concrete manifestations in a material sense of power. But there are also important non-material characteristics as well. These include things like national will, education, political culture, patriotism, how credible a state's actions are, the diplomatic skill of a country's diplomatic corps, the legitimacy of a country, and even going back to kind of constructivism for a moment, ideas. Ideas can be powerful in their own right, right? The Cold War, right? This big ideological dispute between the East and West was primarily about ideas, right? The challenge that communism posed to capitalism. But a couple of other these are important to mention. National will, right? So if a country has a strong number of individuals who believe that it's important to go to war in order to make a point, to prove the strength of a country, that will make it easier for that country, perhaps, to engage in conflict in the future. On the other hand, if a country is relatively benevolent, not prone to warfare, it's not in the culture of the society, that culture, that country, that state, is less likely to engage in any kind of conflict because it's simply not embedded in the DNA of the people themselves. Credibility, just to talk about that really quickly. If a country, this is kind of like the idea of the famous story of a boy who cried wolf. So if a country threatens that it's going to attack another country time and time again, and it never really makes good on that promise or that threat, then that really diminishes the credibility that that country can claim in its happenings in international relations. So on the other hand, if a country does have the resources to back up what it's intending to do, a country makes a pronouncement that it's going to go to war with anyone who harms one of their allies, and then it does actually go through with defending their allies by going to war with another country that attacked one of its allies, that establishes a sense of credibility. So in the future, other countries will look at the behavior of that country and say, well, we don't want to test them because we know that they make good on their promises. Whereas in the first example, if a country makes empty threats and then never follows through on them, that seriously diminishes the credibility that that country has and suggests that they're not to be taken seriously. So I mentioned this in the previous lecture, but power is not only thought of in these terms of kind of hard power, especially when we talk about armed forces in the military, or the size of your nation's economy and how you can use that to funnel it into military resources. There's also a more subtle form of power that has come to be known as soft power. And the example given here is the United States influencing other states to accept free markets or free trade. And this gets back to the non-material characteristics from the previous point, specifically ideas. So the United States and other countries may be able to promote its vision for the international system by virtue of soft power instruments like educational exchange programs. So for example, all throughout the world, China has set up Confucius Institutes at universities, and these institutes are designed to promote Chinese language and culture. And so scholars and observers have described that kind of an approach to spreading one's influence as using a country's soft power. So China's not invading another country using its military force. It's promoting the ideas, it's promoting its language, promoting its culture through educational institutions. And the United States did this as well during the Cold War when it sent students all throughout the world in study abroad programs, not only in the USSR, but in other parts of the world, which has the effect of not only exposing American students to the realities that inhere in other parts of the world, but it's accepted that those students also bring their own values, their own culture to those places. There might be a kind of influencing dynamic that goes on there. So soft power is not quite hard in the sense that there's bullets, there's tanks, there's the wealth of an economy, the geographic size, the natural resources of a country. But it's more about spreading the other less tangible, more abstract notions about a country like the idea of free market capitalism if we're talking about the West. And so I'm going to end on this cartoon, which I thought was kind of funny, taken from a couple years ago. And what you see here are sort of two different kinds of actors. On the one hand, you see a man who looks like Confucius, so sort of representing China, sitting down, looking kind of in a disappointed way or in a forlornly kind of way at the person to his left, which is the K-pop or Korean pop star Psy, who is famous for the song Gangnam Style a couple years ago. And so what you see here, this dynamic that's playing out, is the Confucian character who kind of represents China is looking on at the South Korean pop star and feeling a little bit dismissed because he realizes that the soft power of music, in particular Korean pop music, is galvanizing public attention much more than the kinds of activities, cultural or otherwise, that China is engaging in. So there's a bit of a kind of competitive force here. China is a much larger country than South Korea, and yet South Korea gained a lot of prominence through the spread of its music and other forms of culture like Korean dramas. And so here you see kind of a recognition that China feels a little bit left out by not being able to fully capitalize on exporting its own kind of cultural capital. So that's it for lecture 3 of module 2.